So far we have developed a pretty good sense of what functions are and how they work. Another thing we need to be able to do is graph them. And we're going to be graphing all types of functions in this class. But this first video is just going to be an introduction and give you a general sense of how to construct the graph of a function. So let's look at this first example. We're going to graph this function, f of x equals 5 minus 2x. Right? And remember what this means. This is saying the output of our function is going to be 5 minus 2 times the input of our function. Right? And what we're going to graph is y is equal to f of x. Right? And all this instruction tells us is that y in our graph is going to be represented by the output of the function. Right? So in our graph, when you have x's and y's, your x-axis, x represents the input of the function, y is going to represent the output of the function. Okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to create an input-output table. This is super useful, right? What this is really useful for is this is something that you can use to graph any kind of function. If you are given some kind of function, if you're not sure what it looks like, calculating some values, input-output values, using an input-output table will help you to get a sense of what this graph looks like. All right, so we're going to go ahead and use this input-output table, and we're going to construct a table and draw a graph. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of do our work down below here and then put our work in the table. So let's use some let's pick some values. So let's say I use an input of -1. Let's see what our output would be if I input -1. Well, if I input -1, I can calculate the output of the function like this. 5 minus 2 times that input of -1. So the output when I have an input of -1 is going to be 5 plus 2, which is 7. So the output when we have an input of -1 is 7. All right, so this is our first point. Input -1, output 7. That translates to our graph of an x value of -1, a y value of 7. So -1 comma 7, that's this point right here. All right, let's do another calculation. Right? Let's say we have an input value of 2. Right? And you can choose any input outputs that you want. I'm just choosing some that I think will work out nicely here. So when I input 2, what happens? If I input 2 into my function, my output's going to be 5 minus 2 times that input of 2. That ends up being 5 minus 4, which is 1. So when I input 2, my output is 1. So again, this would be my x value, this would be my y value. 2 comma 1 is right here. And let's just use one more. Let's use an input value of, let's say, 4. So if I were to input 4 into my function, the output would be 5 minus 2 times that input, so 2 times 4. So f of 4 would be 5 minus 8, which is -3. So that's my last point here. 4 comma -3, which is right here. Right? And it turns out that this function is a linear function. And you can see these points line up in a straight line. Right? And you could have done a whole bunch of other points. No matter which inputs that you used, your points would have lined up on this straight line, because this is a linear function. All right, so we're going to look at a second function here. G of x equals x minus 1 squared. This function is not a linear function. Okay, and I'm going to kind of start this off, but I'm going to have you finish this function. Okay, so again, we're going to graph this function. We know that our x values, these are my inputs, and the y is represented by the outputs. So let's construct an input-output table. Okay, and for this graph, I'm going to probably do just maybe two of these for you. Right? So let's say I use an input of how about -2 Actually, let's use -1, 0, and I'm going to have you kind of finish the rest. Maybe do 1, 2, 3. Okay? And in class, we'll talk about how do we know what kinds of inputs to choose. Okay? But it doesn't really matter as long as you have a good sense of what the graph looks like. Okay? All right, so let's see what happens when I input -1. All right, well, when I input -1, my output would be -1 minus 1 squared. Well, -1 minus 1 is -2. -2 squared is +4. So when I input -1, I get an output of 4. Right? So that would be represented by the x comma y -1 comma 4, which is here. Okay, and let's just do one more together here. And let's see what happens when I input 0. Well, when I input 0, our output would be 0 minus 1 squared, which is -1 squared, which is +1. So when I input 0, I get an output of 1. Right? So when x is 0, the y value is going to be 1. So that's this point right here. Okay? I would like you to actually finish this graph. Right? See what happens when you input 1, when you input 2, and when you input 3, and then complete your graph over here. Okay? Remember, this is not going to be a linear function. It's not a straight line. Right? And then we'll take a look at our graph in class tomorrow.